A lot of you probably know a little bit about us, Wellington Environmental. This really isn't a commercial. This is an educational class, but I want to tell you a couple things about us so that you know. We do quite a few different things other than just residential environmental issues that you may know as far as such as asbestos testing and remediation or mold related services or lead. We also do underground storage tanks. We are quite involved in infection prevention across the United States. We handle a lot of the different hospitals. In fact, the Cleveland Clinic uses our training before they allow anybody to go into their facilities around the country, so that people understand how they can keep from causing an infection for a patient or anybody in the hospital. Only 10% of our revenue actually comes from residential environmental work. We do have 48 team members between the office and the people out in the field. So it kind of gives you a feel for what we do. I have always been involved in the residential aspect of this because that's where really I got my start when I first started the company, and that's where we got our first business. Today, what I want to talk about is vermiculite. If you're not familiar with vermiculite, I'm going to tell you a couple things that you might not know about it. And I'm also going to give you some tips on how you can walk your clients or a prospective buyer through a deal that has, vermiculite all of a sudden pops up. And I'm going to tell you about that secret that most people do not know about related to vermiculite. And then we'll talk about, since vermiculite is really an asbestos-containing material, we're going to go through a couple little brief things on asbestos 101 so that we can go through that briefly. Now, vermiculite, if you've seen it before, it kind of looks like cat litter in some respects, or it looks kind of like potting soil. And this is what it looks like in an attic when you uncover it. Sometimes it has fiberglass on top of it or other insulation on top of it. But this is what we call vermiculite. It looks like mica, and it's very lightweight, and it was easy to get, and we'll talk about where it came from. But you may end up with a building inspection, and all of a sudden the building inspector says, hey, we've got vermiculite in the attic. And what they've done is they've reached into the attic and tested the insulation, or looked and saw underneath maybe the fiberglass, like you can see in this photo. Underneath it was a vermiculite, and all of a sudden they say, you know what, you probably ought to test it, or you ought to have an environmental inspector look at things when you run into this. And let me tell you how this evolved in the past. I mean, I've been in business for 33 years. Here at Wellington Environmental. We used to do this before that too, but originally when somebody said, hey, you've got vermiculite, we'd go take a sample of it and we'd send it to the laboratory, and they'd do Polaroid light microscopy on it. And for about $78, we'd know whether or not it contained any asbestos or not. Well, then all of a sudden the regulations changed. And then they said, well, now we want you to do transmission electron microscopy, a much more expensive and much more elaborate type of testing. And those tests usually cost about $250 each. And they want 4 samples of the attic. And this is some of the governing, Illinois and Missouri governing agencies are saying, for us to determine whether or not it is indeed asbestos containing. And then recently, most of the regulators have all moved to, you know what, if you've got vermiculite, you just better assume that it's asbestos-containing material. And I know that sounds confusing and things, but I'm going to explain why that is. The vermiculite was mined in Libby, Montana by W.R. Grace in an open pit mine similar to the one that I'm showing you here. And what they would do is they'd mine this down, and then they'd take it into the mills and they'd mill it down to certain sizes so that they could use it. And it was very good to be used for an insulation since it was very lightweight. It was inexpensive to get it out of the ground. The milling process was cheap, and it was easy to transport. So this became a very popular use, was putting it in attics or in concrete blocks that have the 2 holes in them. Sometimes that and sidewalls, they were filled with vermiculite to act as an insulation material. and it was used quite readily. So it was a very popular material. What they didn't know at first, when they first mined this, was that there were actually veins of asbestos that traveled through this open pit mine. And this is a tremolite vein that I've enacted here on the photo. So people didn't really understand that, hey, we're getting vermiculite, but now as time went on, and as W.R. Grace got more sophisticated in this, they found out, we've got tremolite type of asbestos in this mine as well. And so we don't know which bags of the insulation contain the tremolite. Well, eventually the EPA went in and closed down the whole city of Libby, Montana, because of asbestos exposure. And this was about 20 years ago, and they had quite a few write-ups on it in a lot of different newspapers. W.R. Grace filed for bankruptcy because they couldn't afford all the asbestos claims that were coming out of this. So in essence, the big important thing is nobody can say which bag of the insulation contained the tremolite type of asbestos. And so you can see where this gets confusing and where we've evolved from what we talked about from the polarized light microscopy, checking it, to the transmission electron microscopy, and now we're just assuming that it contains asbestos. So it is one of those gray areas that we don't like to run into because there are no clear-cut answers, but for the most part, what we're talking about, when we have vermiculite, and now with all the federal agencies pushing to say, you're just going to assume that it contains asbestos, you don't want to get into one of those situations where you sampled it and it was an asbestos, and then your seller, your client, goes to sell their house in 5 years. Somebody else tests it and they find out it is asbestos. So it's a gray area. It's something I want you to be aware of. But there is a secret that most people do not know about vermiculite. And I know it's going to upset your buyers and sellers when it's found. But the secret is that W.R. Grace, when they had this, was they had to set up a trust fund. And the trust fund has been set up to help pay for remediation costs when you qualify. And I'm going to explain how the qualification process works. There's a few steps that we have to take to be involved in the trust fund. We do one of these, at least one of these a week, and we have never been turned down by the trust fund yet. But if it works correctly, then your client will be paid 55% of the removal cost plus the re-insulation costs. So this is quite a benefit when dealing with vermiculite. And we have 2 of those projects going on this week. In fact, all of them covered under the trust fund. Here's how it works, just so that you know. A large bag of the vermiculite has to be collected, and we can do it for you, or if you use another environmental contractor and they're familiar with this, they know how much to collect. That is sent into the trust fund's laboratory for analysis, and they analyze the material to make sure it qualifies that it came from their Libby, Montana site, because that's what's qualified under the trust fund. Then photographs must be taken of the attic with the existing conditions, with the vermiculite in place. And then photographs have to be taken after the vermiculite is removed and the attic is empty. And then photographs again once it's re-insulated. At the end of all this, all these photographs go in to the trust fund along with a 2-page form that it's really easy to fill out. But this is so that they can make sure that they're not getting ripped off. They can make sure that the photographs all look like they're coming from the same house and that this indeed really did occur. So that's kind of how the trust fund works. The best thing is you really should focus your client on the benefit, because they're going to be upset with the fact that if they're the seller and all of a sudden they've got vermiculite and they don't know what to do, and they could be faced with this cost of removing it, or you've got a buyer that's buying the house and they think, oh my God, I might have asbestos in the attic. Maybe focusing them on, hey, you've got a safer house by removing the asbestos. We've got new insulation in there. And when we re-insulate the attics after we remove it, we go back to an R40. So you're having a much better energy savings in the house. So I think that's a benefit for your clients, is try to get them to refocus on getting rid of this stuff. They don't have to deal with it again. If they're the buyers, when they go to resell it, and if they're the sellers, it's something that they don't have to disclose to the next person. Now, let me explain quickly how we remove it, just so you understand. When we first started 33 years ago, we used to hand vacuum this out with special HEPA vacuums, and then we'd bag it up in the attic, and we'd put it through that little hole in the ceiling, and then we'd take all these bags out of the house, and so we've got people running through the house all day long. What we do now, we have a truck-mounted vacuum system that's outside the house, and we use this hose, and we've got a 6-inch diameter hose that goes in there, and we vacuum everything out of here, and that hose runs out a window or something, so that we have nobody going through your house that's got bags of asbestos. And we also line that, we put a protective plastic covering over the hose as it travels through the house, so it's clean and won't put marks on doors and things. And over here on that left-hand photo, you can see where we vacuumed out the vermiculite in the existing fiberglass and how clean it is afterwards. So it's a much faster process, much easier to do it, and of course it's much cheaper now because of that process. Here's a house right over in Webster Groves, close to where you all are. We just did the attic about 4 weeks ago, and ran it out of a bathroom window. This plastic sheet that you see that's hanging down from the window, that is to protect the house from the hose knocking into the wood, and so we don't leave any marks. But this goes right outside, so it's a much faster, cleaner way to operate the whole system. Now, on review, so you understand a little bit about where the vermiculite came from, that it came from Libby, Montana, and that the reason why it's such a gray area now is the fact that it had that vein of, had multiple veins of tremolite type of asbestos that went through the vermiculite mine. So we can't really ever say which bags of the insulation contain the asbestos. So, I understand it can be a problematic issue, but I did want you to understand at least where it came from, and our secret, the trust fund, because paying 55% of all the cost of removal and re-insulation is terrific, and we get people that use that all the time. Now, I thought it might be beneficial in this first class is to tell you a little bit about asbestos. We'll just go through some of the basics. Since we're talking about tremolite, which is one type of asbestos, I do want you to understand we do run into homes in Webster, Kirkwood, Sappington area, all these areas. If the house was built before 1980, there's a good chance there's asbestos someplace in that house. Asbestos was manufactured into 3,000 different building materials, so you can almost always find asbestos someplace. And sometimes it's going to be in strange places. I'll show you a couple pictures, but most of the time we're going to see it in the usual suspects. But I want you to understand why asbestos was used in so many things. And the reason is because it's an extremely strong fiber, and it was used to mixed in with other things, and it became a great strength binder for when other materials were made. For instance, floor tile or pipe insulation and things like that. It was also non-flammable. So the amazing thing is I've seen buildings burn down, and the only thing left is the asbestos. It's an incredibly flame-resistant product. And in our high school biology and chemistry labs, we used to have the countertops were made out of asbestos, because if we spilled acid or we caught them on fire, it wouldn't catch on fire, and the acid wouldn't damage the asbestos transite that was on the countertops. And it was used because it was a quality insulator. It was like vermiculite. It was very lightweight, it was inexpensive, and it was readily available. Those of you that like trivia, the Greeks used to use, they would weave their tablecloths out of asbestos. they'd have these great big feasts, and then they'd wrap up all the food and everything that was on the table in the asbestos tablecloth and throw that into the bonfire. And after about 2 hours, they'd pull that tablecloth back out and it would be unscorched, but all the food and everything else would be gone. It was like their own dishwashing system. So asbestos has been around for a long time. It's been used in quite a few different products. When I was in graduate school, I used to work at Carondelet Foundry, and we made fire hydrants. And we used to wear asbestos aprons so that we wouldn't catch our clothes on fires. There's many, many different materials, and as I mentioned, over 3,000 that contained asbestos. Another trivial point is they even used asbestos snow in the movie White Christmas, and in fact, in a lot of the Hollywood productions, because it was a great product. It was lightweight, and it was clean. It was nice white when they used it. It was just one of those things that they didn't know the hazards at the time. Now, when we look at whether or not a material contains asbestos, and this isn't something that you need to remember, but this is how it happens for us as licensed inspectors. We take a sample of it, and when it goes to the microscopist to look at it under a microscope, the first thing they do is does it fall into one of these two groups of asbestos? And so they look different under the microscope. And so when it falls into one of those two groups, it could be either chrysotile type asbestos, or there's other 5 types of asbestos: amosite, gracilolite, tremolite, actinolite, or anthophyllite. And 98% of all the asbestos in the U.S. is chrysotile type asbestos. Now you might say, well, hey, we just talked about tremolite and vermiculite. Tremolite, that's the main asbestos type that's in vermiculite. But when you consider all the rest of the 3,300 products that are made out of asbestos, chrysotile is the most common, and it comes from Canada. Whereas amosite is the second most common type of asbestos, and it comes from Africa. These two, it's important for those of us that remove asbestos to understand the type of asbestos, because chrysotile will accept water, which means we can spray it down with a mist and it will settle to the ground faster. Whereas amosite will not, water is not attracted and won't attach to it. And so amosite stays in the air for much longer periods of time, and we need to use a special surfactant to get it out of the air. And the problem is when it's airborne, asbestos is classified as a hazardous air pollutant. And we all remember the photographs from 9/11, because those buildings had fireproofing in them, as well as pipe insulation that contained asbestos. And we worry about asbestos when it becomes airborne, since it's an air pollutant and not a chemical that you would drink like Clorox or something and know immediately that you're going to be sick. Asbestos is something that has a latency problem with it, which means it takes between 15 and 40 years for it to fully develop in our mesothelium, or the pleura of our lungs. So you'll hear about the 2 most common types of asbestos-related diseases, and that's asbestosis and mesothelioma. And for the most part, if you're watching late night TV and you see all the lawyers and the doctors that are on there, they want to know about if you worked in a facility and have you checked for mesothelioma. And the reason is mesothelioma is only caused by asbestos exposure, and it's always fatal. Whereas asbestosis can be caused by other types of exposure. And so the lawyers are really going after the mesothelioma cases. And if you've known anybody that's had mesothelioma, it's a very painful disease, because every time you breathe in or breathe out and our lungs expand and contract, it's very painful for that person because of the scar tissue that's built up on the inside of their lungs. So when we talk about asbestos being a hazardous air pollutant, you will often see on a building inspection report that the asbestos is friable. Friable is a term that the EPA came up with, and what it means is, can it become airborne? So if you can take it with a piece of it with simple hand pressure, When it's dry and crumble it, then it can become airborne. So friable is a word that you may see in reports, and that's something that you should be aware of, in the fact that that means it's dangerous. Now here's a house in the Central West End from last week I was in, and I was looking at, they wanted the asbestos pipe insulation removed. Some of it had already been removed, but you can see in this right-hand photo, there's still asbestos that wasn't properly removed, and you can see at the bottom of this 90-degree fitting, there's still some asbestos fibers that are attached. And up here we've got asbestos in the left-hand photo that doesn't have the jacketing on it anymore. This is what we consider friable, and in these cases, we want to remove it rather than repair it. Many times, homes in the Central West End or older homes in U City, places like that, if the insulation is in good shape and it still has the jacketing on it, then we recommend, and the boiler system's still being used, of course, then we recommend repairing it and encapsulating it. Similar to when you break your arm and you go to the doctor and he sets it in a cast, it'll last decades and decades, and it'll last forever. This is a great material. We just don't want it to become airborne in the fact. Now, friable, and then you hear non-friable. Non-friable can be something like floor tile. So all of a sudden you're selling a house and somebody says, hey, that's asbestos tile in the basement. And because it's that 9-inch by 9-inch diameter, those are the measurements of the tile. 98% of the 9-inch by 9-inch tile contains asbestos, chrysotile type asbestos, plus the mastic, the glue that's underneath it, also contains asbestos. 12 by 12-inch tile, if it was made before 1980, can contain asbestos as well. But this is a non-friable material. So if you got a buyer or seller and they say, I've got floor tile in the basement, it's in good condition, do I have to remove it? No. It's in great condition. You can keep it the way it is. People can still walk on it, play on it, do whatever they want. You're not going to get the fibers out of it unless you sand it or drill it. You can put new flooring on top of it. You can carpet over it. You can do whatever you want. Now, some people like Lowe's and Home Depot, they won't put in new floor unless you've had your floor tested. And if it comes back as asbestos, they don't want to deal with it until it's been removed. But just so you know, it's considered a non-friable material, which means it's not a safety hazard for the house as long as it's not drilled into or sanded or cut in some way. Now, linoleum, that's sheet flooring. The top surface on linoleum is a vinyl and it's not asbestos. But if it was manufactured before 1980, and Armstrong Flooring made a lot of it, there's a white cottony material, and you can just see basically the edge of the cottony material. That contains chrysotile type asbestos. This, when this flooring is in place, it's non-friable. It's not dangerous. But if somebody wants to redo the floors, they can put a new floor on top of it. Or if they want to remove it, now you're dealing with an asbestos situation with linoleum. Another thing you may run into, sometimes garages or actually the homes have asbestos siding. And this asbestos siding was used for multiple reasons. One, it's made with Portland cement. Extremely durable, will last a century on most buildings unless somebody breaks it or destroys it in some manner. It's a non-friable material. It's not a danger to anybody's health. Now, if they want to re-side the garage or the house, they can either put new siding right on top of it, or if they want it removed, then it has to be dealt with as asbestos. But asbestos siding is a non-friable material. Sometimes you'll run into some homes, and we have some neighborhoods in West County and some other places where the whole neighborhoods, they've mixed asbestos in with the popcorn type finish on the ceilings. And to sample it, it's $78 a sample to sample it, just so that you know whether or not it does contain asbestos. If it's still intact, like this top picture shows, then it's not a danger. It's not going to be a problem for anybody in the house. It's when it starts to delaminate, like shown in the bottom picture, is when we worry about it getting into the airstream again. And so, or if they're going to put in can lights or they're going to change the ceiling, then you'd want to know whether or not that textured material contains asbestos. So popcorn type ceiling finishes, maybe 40% of the time contains asbestos, and it really depends on whether or not the builder used it with their mixture. Another thing that we'll run into quite often in our Sunset Hills, Webster, Kirkwood homes, Maplewood, is asbestos tape material. And this asbestos tape is normally found on the outside of the ductwork, so it's not in the airstream. So the good point is since it's on the outside of the ductwork and it's not on the inside of the airstream, we recommend repairing and encapsulating it. That means basically going over it wherever it's delaminated, such as here where it's starting to fall off. We reinforce that with a fiberglass patch, and then we coat these similar to when you break your arm and you go to the doctor and they set it in a cast. It'll last decades, and it's great. It's on the outside of the airstream. What you're going to find with a lot of building inspectors on this left photo, the way you see it in some homes is you just see the trailing edge of it. When we go from our horizontal runs of ductwork and all of a sudden we transition to go up into the walls, that's where they lined the ductwork with this asbestos cloth material. It's made with chrysotile type asbestos. Here I've got a house over on Litzinger that just a couple of weeks ago, they were rehabbing and they opened up the walls for the kitchen to go into the family room. And here we've got 2 runs of ductwork that you can see the actual asbestos on the outside of it. Now, in these cases, it's easy for us. We just wrap this in plastic and take out the whole sections. But for the most part, when you've got these trailing edges of asbestos, we just repair and encapsulate and leave it there. So you may run into that stuff, and sometimes it's inside the wall cavities of the homes. So I want you to remember basically the term friable when we talk about asbestos means that it can be crumbled with simple hand pressure when it's dry and become airborne. And so when we've got a situation like that, we probably would want to remove it unless we can do a repair on it that somebody else isn't going to damage. So in a lot of cases, pipe insulation, tape insulation, we recommend repairing those rather than removing them. It's much cheaper, much faster. It's better for your clients, and nothing's happening. And then sometimes you may have asbestos floor tile, items like that, or that asbestos transite on the exterior of the building that you really don't need to do anything with. They're just one of those things that, unfortunately, it contains asbestos, and it's something you should be aware of. But if you ever have questions, certainly you can contact us. Now, I know I threw a lot at you real quick with the vermiculite and with asbestos and what we're doing. And this was basically because one of the other agencies said, since we're all locked up and nobody's coming to our offices anymore to train, we thought it might be good to have some educational series. The next 2 that I have are on mold. And the next one in particular, since it seems like we run into mold almost daily, and why is that? And I'm going to explain the why and what the 3 main things are that mold needs to colonize in that next class, and it's about the same length as this one. And then I want to tell you about some cases where we've got more and more building inspectors are taking air samples and why that is. But then all of a sudden you get a reading and they can't tell you what to do to correct the situation. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about next time and what we need to look at so that we know what's happening. Certainly I can address any questions if you have them, but I appreciate you all even taking time to come to this today.